The star made the stuntman do the fall for the 8th time, and this time he threw a water bottle at him while he was still on the ground. It was 104 degrees in the Utah desert, and the fall was a real one, a 22-foot drop-off, a rigged ledge onto an airbag that the crew had to reset and repressurize after every take. And the young stuntman had landed it clean on the first take, and cleaner on the second, and the star had kept calling for another one anyway. Not because the shot needed it, but because making the man in the dusty pads get up and climb the ledge and throw himself off it again was a way of showing 40 people who was in charge. On the 8th take, when the stuntman hauled himself off the airbag, breathing hard, the star walked over and threw a half-full water bottle that bounced off the man's chest, and he said, loud, so the whole crew could hear it, that the kid was replaceable, that there were 100 bodies in this town who would jump off a ledge for scale, that his life was not worth one of his shots, and that he should be grateful anyone let him near a real movie at all. The stuntman did not say anything back. He picked up the water bottle. He set it on the equipment cart. He climbed the ledge and did the fall a 9th time, perfectly, because that was the job. And when he came off the airbag, he looked at the star for a moment, not with anger, and he said 4 quiet words, and then he went to get checked by the medic. The words were, "It's a long business." The star, whose name was Brett Caldwell, did not hear them or did not care, and forgot the whole afternoon by dinner. He did not know the young stuntman's name. He never learned it. And 30 years later, he would walk into a room to beg for the last good part of his fading career. And the man who held that part in his hands, the man every door in that town now opened for, would be the nobody in the dusty pads he had thrown a water bottle at in the desert. And his name, the one Brett never bothered to learn, was Keanu Reeves. But to understand how the man on the ground became the man behind the desk, you have to go back to that summer in 1994, and to a stunt coordinator named Hal Brennan, who kept a notebook. The film was called Blackwater Ridge, an action picture shooting out past Moab in the Red Rock country, the kind of mid-budget movie they made a lot of in those years, all chases and falls and one collapsing mine. And it was the kind of job a young actor took when he was between the small parts that paid nothing and the big parts that had not come yet, and might never come. In the summer of 1994, Keanu Reeves was 30 years old, and he was exactly that young actor. Not a name, not a face anyone in the country would have recognized. A working performer taking whatever came. And what had come that summer was Blackwater Ridge, where he had a small speaking part as a doomed mine foreman. And because the production was cheap and he could do it, and the money was real, a second job doubling for the falls and the fire gags that the lead actor would not do himself. It is worth understanding what that double life on a set actually meant, because it is the texture of the whole story. A stunt performer is the person who does the thing that would kill the star. When you watch a man fall off a building, or get thrown through a window, or stagger out of a burning car, you are almost never watching the actor whose face you know. You are watching someone whose face you will never know. A trained professional who has spent years learning how to fall and burn and crash in ways that look lethal and are merely extremely dangerous, and who does it for a fraction of the money and none of the fame, so that the famous person can be famous and intact. It is one of the few jobs in the world where the entire point is that you not be noticed, where doing your work perfectly means that the audience believes it was someone else. And the people who do it are, almost to a person, among the most skilled and least credited workers on any set. And they know it. And they do it anyway, because they love the craft, and because someone has to be the one who is willing to hit the ground. And it is a craft, a real and exacting one, which is the thing most people never understand when they watch a stunt and think the person doing it is simply brave or simply crazy. Bravery has very little to do with it. What it actually takes is years of learning a body of knowledge that has been passed down hand to hand for a century. The physics of falling and the engineering of the rigs that make a lethal-looking fall survivable. A high fall onto an airbag, the kind Keanu did off that ledge, is not a matter of courage but of precise technique. The way you leave the platform, The rotation you put on your body in the air, the exact attitude you have to hit the bag in, flat and spread to distribute the force. Because landing wrong on an airbag can break you as surely as landing on concrete. There is the ratchet, a cable system that can yank a performer backward off their feet at the speed of a real explosion, calibrated so it stops just short of tearing a shoulder from its socket. There is the air ram, a pneumatic platform that launches a body into the air to sell an impact. There is the fire gag, the most frightening of all, where a performer is coated in a special insulating gel, and then a layer of flammable adhesive, and then actually set on fire, and must hold a precise choreography while burning, knowing to the second how long the gel will protect the skin before the heat's through, with safety personnel and extinguishers, and a hard time limit standing between the shot and a hospital. Every one of these is a discipline with its own years of apprenticeship, its own old hands who know the thing that is not written down. And the people who master them are athletes and engineers and artists at once, performing the one art form whose highest achievement is to be invisible, to make the audience certain they were watching someone else. Keanu loved it. That was the thing nobody expected of a young actor, that he genuinely loved the stunt work, the physics of it, the discipline, the way a fall that looked like chaos was in fact a precise sequence of choices, the rotation, the point of contact, the breath. He had learned it from the man who ran the stunt team on Blackwater Ridge, a coordinator named Hal Brennan, who was 40 years old that summer and had been falling off things for money since he was 19, and who had taken one look at the eager young actor, who kept hanging around the stunt rigging on his off hours and decided to teach him properly. The way the old hands taught, the ones they thought were worth teaching. He was not the only one who taught him. There was a woman on Hal's team that summer named Ross Tanner, a veteran high fall and fire performer in her 40s, one of the toughest people on the production and one of the kindest. And she had been the one who first took the young actor seriously, who showed him how to pack an airbag and how to check a rigging point and how to tell, before you ever left the platform, whether someone had set the gag up to keep you alive or just to get the shot. Roz had been doing the work long enough to have buried friends who did it, and she had a rule of her own that she gave to Keanu early, which was that you never let anyone, no matter how big their name, talk you into a gag your gut said was wrong, because the name would survive the mistake, and you would not. She looked out for him on that set the way the good ones look out for the young, without making anything of it, sharing her water in the heat, telling him when his rotation was lazy, standing a little closer than she needed to. When Brett Caldwell started in on him, a silent witness making sure that whatever else happened, the kid was not entirely alone out there. Years later, when Keanu had the power to look after the stunt community, part of what he was doing, though he never said it, was paying back Roz Tanner, who had shared her water with a nobody in the desert and asked for nothing. Hal Brennan is the second most important person in this story, so it is worth knowing him. He was a big, quiet man, with a body that cataloged 30 years of the job, the knee that did not bend all the way, the shoulder that clicked, the fingers that had been broken and reset more than once, and he carried himself with the particular calm of a person who has spent his whole life one mistake away from death and has made his peace with it by being very, very careful. Hal had a rule, and the rule was the whole of his philosophy, and it was this: the stunt is never worth the body. You could always reset the shot. You could not reset a spine. He had walked off 2 productions in his career over directors who wanted a stunt done a way that was not safe, had given up good money and good references rather than let one of his people get hurt for a shot. Because Hal Brennan believed, all the way down, that the people who did the falling were worth more than any picture, and he ran his sets that way, and the stunt performers who worked for him would have followed him into a fire, which on several occasions they more or less did. And Hal kept a notebook, a spiral notebook, the kind you buy at a drugstore, and in it he wrote down every gag his team performed, the date, the conditions, the rigging, who did what, how many takes, and any time something went wrong or somebody got pushed past what was safe. He had kept these notebooks for 20 years. He had a drawer full of them. He did it partly because a good coordinator documents everything for insurance and liability, and partly for a deeper reason, which was that Hal Brennan believed someone should write down what these invisible people actually did, that the record should exist somewhere even if it never had a name attached to it on a screen, that the falls should be witnessed. He had explained it to Keanu once, late on that shoot, in the way that older men explain the thing that is really their whole creed while pretending it is just a practical habit. He said that the studios kept records of everything that cost money, every dollar and every hour and every gallon of fuel, but that nobody kept a record of what it cost the bodies. That a stunt performer could give 30 years and a spine to this business and end up as a single uncredited line in a call sheet that got thrown away when the picture wrapped. So he wrote it down. He wrote down the names the credits left off, and the falls the budgets reduced to a line item, and the times a director or a star pushed one of his people past the edge of what was safe, not because he could do anything with it, usually, but because the alternative was to let it vanish, to agree with the studios that these lives were not worth recording. A witness, Hal said, is not someone who can fix what happened. A witness is just someone who refuses to let it be as if it never happened. That is a smaller thing than justice, and it is not nothing. And sometimes, he said, it is the only thing on offer, and you do it anyway. Keanu was 30 years old, and he filed that away without fully understanding it, and it took him 3 decades and a photocopied page to understand it completely. He did not know, that summer, that one page of one of those notebooks would matter enormously 30 years later. He just wrote down what happened, the way he always did, including the afternoon a star named Brett Caldwell made a young double, do us 22-foot, fall 9 times in 104-degree heat for no reason but cruelty, and threw a water bottle at him, and called his life worthless in front of the crew. Hal wrote it all down. He even underlined it. It is worth slowing down on that afternoon, because the hook of this story compresses it, and the full shape of it matters. The shot was simple enough on paper, the mine foreman losing his footing on a collapsing ledge and falling into the dark, a fall, the script, 6 words. They had built the rig at the base of a real sandstone outcrop, the airbag rated for the height, the landing zone cleared, and Keanu in the foreman's wardrobe over a layer of pads, and Hal himself on the bag, checking the pressure between every take, because Hal did not delegate the thing that kept his people alive. The first take was clean. Keanu left the ledge with a lazy backward rotation that read perfectly on camera, hit the bag flat, rolled off, and Hal gave him a small nod, which from Hal was a standing ovation. The director had it. They could have moved on. But Brett Caldwell was watching from his chair, in the shade, with a sport drink and a sense that the day was not sufficiently about him, and he called out that it had looked soft, that the foreman should sell more terror on the way down, which was a note about a stunt double's face that would be a blur on screen and was really just a way of putting his thumb on the scene. So they did it again, and it was clean again. And Brett found another note. The arms were wrong. The timing was late. The whole thing lacked weight. Each note more obviously invented than the last, each one requiring the young double to climb back up the outcrop in the building heat and throw himself off it once more while a man in a chair sipped a cold drink and found him insufficient. By the 6th take, the crew had gone quiet in the particular way a crew goes quiet when it is watching something ugly and is not in a position to stop it. And Hal Brennan had walked over to the director and said, "Lo, that the shot was got, that it had been got 5 takes ago, that the heat was a safety issue, and he was not going to keep his man jumping for no reason." And the director, caught between his coordinator and his star, did the cowardly arithmetic that pressure produces, and asked for just a couple more. That was when it became cruelty in its pure form. 2 more takes that everyone present knew were punishment. And on the 8th, when Keanu came off the bag, soaked through and breathing hard, Brett got up out of his chair and walked over and threw the water bottle. Brett Caldwell was 35 years old in 1994. And he was, it has to be said, genuinely good at the thing he did, which makes him a more interesting villain than the talentless ones. He had a real screen presence, a face the camera liked, an instinct for a moment, and he had ridden those gifts to the kind of mid-level stardom, where he was the lead in pictures like Blackwater Ridge. Not an A-lister, but a name. A man whose face on a poster could open a movie in a certain size of market. And he was, underneath the talent, one of the most frightened men on the set. Although it took Keanu years to understand that, because the fear did not look like fear. It looked like cruelty. It looked like a man who needed everyone around him to be smaller so that he could feel large, who humiliated the crew because the crew could not fire him, who was hardest on exactly people who were most replaceable, so the day players and the stunt doubles and the assistants, because their replaceability was the thing he was most afraid of in himself. Because here is what Brett Caldwell knew, in the place where men keep the things they cannot look at directly. He knew that his gifts were not enough. He knew that screen presence is a wasting asset, that the camera that loved his face at 35 would cool on it at 50, that there were younger and hungrier versions of him arriving every year on every bus into that town, and that the entire structure of his importance rested on a foundation that time was already eating. He was, in the deepest sense, replaceable, and he knew it, and he could not bear it, and so he found the most replaceable person on any set he worked, the anonymous double who did his falling for him, and he made that person eat the fear he could not swallow himself. The water bottle he threw at Keanu Reeves in the desert was, if you understood it, thrown at his own reflection. He just did not have the courage to know that, and a man who will not look at the thing driving him is a man who cannot be changed by anything. Which is why this story does not end with his redemption. You could even, if you were inclined to be generous, see the shape of how he had been made, because cruelty is built and not born. Brett had come up in an era of the business that worshipped the difficult star, that told young actors the way to be taken seriously was to be feared, that confused a reputation for being impossible with a reputation for being important, and he had learned the lesson early and learned it too well. He had been humiliated himself, surely, on the way up by men who had what he wanted, and he had drawn from it the most common and most poisonous conclusion available, which is not that humiliation is wrong, and I will not do it to others, but that humiliation flows downhill, and the only question is whether you are above or below, and he had spent his whole career making sure he was above. None of that excuses the water bottle. It only explains it, and explanation is not exoneration, it is just the difference between a monster and a man. And Brett was not a monster, which is worse in a way, because a monster cannot help itself and a man can. And Brett was a man who could have chosen differently at any of 10,000 small moments, and chose for every time. The chair in the shade, and the invented note, and the pleasure of watching someone smaller climb the ledge again. The tragedy of him, and it is a tragedy even if he is not sympathetic, is that the thing he did to outrun his fear of being replaceable is the precise thing that guaranteed he would be replaced. Because the talent was real, but the talent was never the problem. And the part of him that threw the water bottle was busy, all those years, writing the reason the town would eventually be glad to let him go. The young stuntman did the fall a 9th time, and got checked by the medic. And that night, in the production trailer that served as a medical station, Hal Brennan found him icing a shoulder and sat down across from him and said, the thing that Keanu would carry for 30 years, the counterweight to the water bottle. Hal said, I want you to listen to me, because you're going to need this. That man up there, the way he treated you today, that's not because you're nothing. That's because he's terrified he's nothing. You did a perfect fall 9 times in heat that would put down most men, and you did it clean, and you got up every time. That's not nothing. That's about as far from nothing as it gets in this business. And then Hal said the part that mattered most. He said, this town is small, and it has a long memory, and it remembers 2 things about a person. It remembers whether you were good, and it remembers how you treated people who couldn't do anything for you. Caldwell's banking everything on the first one. He's going to find out the second one comes due. You just keep being good and keep being decent, and you wait. It's a long business. And the young man looked up, because Hal had used these 4 words he had said to Brett on the airbag. And Hal smiled and said, "I heard you say that to him. Best thing anybody said all day. It's truer than you know." Keanu did not answer right away. He sat there with the ice on his shoulder, and the heat of the day still coming off the metal walls of the trailer, and he turned the words over, and what he felt was not comfort exactly. Because comfort was not the thing Hal was offering. Hal was offering something harder and more useful than comfort, which was a frame, a way to hold the afternoon, that did not require either pretending it had not happened, or letting it curdle into the thing it could so easily become. A younger or weaker version of him might have taken the humiliation and built a wall out of it, become hard, become someone who got his own back the first chance he got, paid the cruelty forward the way Brett had surely once paid forward, a cruelty done to him. Hal was steering him off that road without quite naming it, telling him that the way through was not to harden but to wait, not to forget but to remember correctly, to keep the afternoon as evidence of who he did not want to be rather than as a debt to be collected. It was the single most important piece of instruction Keanu received that whole summer, more important than any rigging point or rotation. And it did not come from the part of Hal Brennan that knew about falling. It came from the part that had watched a lot of good people get bent by this business and had worked out which ones broke and which ones lasted, and had decided that this young actor was worth telling. Keanu would spend 30 years proving him right, and the worst part, the part that still caught in his throat decades later, was that Hal did not live to see the whole of it, died 2 years before the afternoon in the meeting room, when the 4 words finally, fully came due. Keanu Reeves kept that. He kept all of it. He kept the fall, and the water bottle, and Hal's notebook, and the 4 words. And he carried them out of that desert and into the 30 years that followed. The years in which the thing nobody could have predicted happened, which is that the anonymous young double became one of the most respected men in the entire industry. And not only because of what he could do on a screen, but because of how he carried himself off of it. Because somewhere in that desert, watching a frightened star throw a water bottle at a man on the ground, Keanu had decided exactly what kind of person he was never going to be, and had spent 30 years being the opposite of it. And the town, which has a long memory, had noticed. Now let me stop here for a second. Because the 30 years in between are the part the story skips and the part that explains everything, and you should understand them before we get to the room. The first of those years were not glamorous, and it is worth saying so, because the way these stories usually get told makes it sound as though the wronged young man went home from the desert and became a star by the next reel. And it was nothing like that. He went back to the work. He took the next job, which was small, and the one after that, which was smaller. And he kept doubling and kept taking the day parts and kept hanging around the stunt rigging, learning the craft. And there were years in there where nothing he did got noticed by anyone, where the 4 words he had said on the airbag, "It's a long business," must have felt less like wisdom and more like a sentence. The town did not owe him anything for being decent, and it did not pay him anything for it. Not for a long time. And that is the part that matters, because a man who is decent only when it pays is not decent at all. He is just running a slower con. Keanu was decent in the years when it did not pay, when there was no evidence it would ever pay, when Brett Caldwell was still a name on posters, and the young double who had been humiliated in the desert was still climbing ledges for other Brett Caldwells on other pictures, and biting back the same retorts, and picking up the same thrown bottles. He did it because Hal had told him to, and because something in him had decided in that desert who he was going to be, and you do not get to choose who you are going to be. Only on the days the choosing is rewarded. The reward, when it finally came late and came slow, and came in the structural quiet way that real power comes. And by the time it arrived, he had been the decent version of himself for so long that it was no longer a choice he was making, but simply the shape he had hardened into, which is the only way decency ever actually survives contact with power, by becoming a habit so old it precedes the power, so that when the power arrives, there is already a person there to hold it. What happened to Keanu Reeves over those 30 years is that he got good, and then he got known, and then he got powerful, and at every step he did the thing that the desert had taught him, which was to remember the people at the bottom, because he had been one. When he became a star, he was famous on every set he worked, for treating the crew exactly the way he treated the director, for knowing the names of the grips and the drivers and the stunt team, for the well-documented and slightly legendary habit of giving things away, of taking care of the people who took care of the production. When he gained the power to get films made, to put money behind projects through a production company he owned, he used some of that power to do a specific thing that almost no one else at his level did, which was to fund and protect the stunt community, to insist on safety standards that cost money, to make sure the invisible people who did the falling were credited and paid and looked after, because he had been the man on the ground, and he had never once forgotten what it felt like to have a water bottle thrown at you for doing a perfect job. It is worth understanding how power actually accumulates in that town, because it is the mechanism that makes the ending possible, and it is not the mechanism most people imagine. Power in the film business is not only fame. Fame is the visible part, the part on the poster, and it is real, but it is shallow and it wastes, exactly as Brett discovered. The deeper power is structural, and it lives in ownership, in the production companies and the financing entities, and the holding structures that actually decide which films get made and who gets cast in them. And that power is quiet and patient and largely invisible to the public, and it does not wane with the camera's affection, because it was never about the camera. Over 30 years, Keanu had built that kind of power, the structural kind, had moved from being the body that did the falling to being one of the names on the documents that decided what got filmed at all. And he had done it the slow way, picture by picture, relationship by relationship, with a reputation that compounded like interest. And the reputation was the asset. In a town that small, where everyone has worked with everyone, and the same few hundred people will cross your path for 50 years, your reputation is the only thing you truly own. And it is built not in the big visible moments, but in 10,000 small invisible ones, in how you treat the people who cannot do anything for you, because those people talk, and the town listens, and the ledger is always open. Keanu had spent 30 years making deposits in that ledger. Brett had spent 30 years making withdrawals. Neither of them could see the balance, but the town could, and the town, in the end, is the one that pays out. The industry knew this about him. It was part of why every door opened. He had become good, exactly as Hal predicted, and he had beaten decency, exactly as Hal advised, and the town had remembered both. And what happened to Brett Caldwell over those same 30 years is that the thing he was most afraid of came true, slowly, the way it always comes true. The camera cooled on him. The leads got smaller and then stopped coming. The reputation he had built, the difficult star, the man who berated crews and burned through goodwill, followed him from production to production the way reputations do in a town with a long memory, until the producers who could afford to avoid him did, and the ones who could not afford him at all were all that was left. He had made good money and spent it like a man who assumed the money would always come, and it had not always come. And by the time he was 65, he was a man whose name still meant something to audiences of a certain age, but meant something very different, something cautionary, to the people who actually hired. He had been replaceable after all. Time had replaced him, exactly as he had always feared, and the cruelty he had used to hold the fear at bay had only accelerated the thing it was meant to prevent. Because the same town that remembers whether you were good remembers how you treated people. And Brett Caldwell, it turned out, had been compiling a record the whole time, the same way Hal Brennan had, except that Brett's record was written in the memory of every person he had ever made smaller, and it had all come due. Which brings us to the room. It was 30 years later, almost to the season, and there was a film being put together. A serious one, the kind of late-career prestige project that can resurrect a fading actor if the part is right and the people behind it are willing. And Brett Caldwell wanted it more than he had wanted anything in 20 years. It was the part of an aging gunfighter, a real part, the kind of role that wins awards and rewrites a career's final chapter. And Brett had heard he was being considered, and he had called in every favor he had left, which was not many, to get a meeting with the people making it. He did not know much about who was making it. He knew it was being produced through a company he had heard of but never dealt with. A company with a reputation for taking care of its people and for backing difficult, worthwhile films. And he knew there was money behind it, and that the money was patient, which in that town is the rarest and most valuable kind. He did not know who owned the company. He had not bothered to find out, because Brett Caldwell had never in his life bothered to find out who the quiet people behind things were, which was, when you think about it, the exact flaw that had thrown a water bottle in the desert 30 years before. He walked into the meeting in a good suit that was a little too big for him now, because he had been a bigger man once, and he did his old charm, the presence that still worked in a room even when it had stopped working on a poster, and he sat down across a table from a producer and a director he had met before, and a third man he had not, a man of about 60, in a plain dark jacket who sat a little back from the table and did not say much at first. And Brett did his pitch, talked about the part, talked about what he understood about the aging gunfighter, talked, if we are honest, mostly about himself, the way he always had. And the quiet man in the dark jacket watched him do it, and listened. And at a certain point, the producer deferred a question to the quiet man, called him by his first name, asked what he thought. And Brett Caldwell looked at the man whose decision this apparently was, really looked at him for the first time, and felt the floor of his stomach drop, because he knew the face, and he could not place it, and the note being able to place, it was its own kind of terror, the sense of a debt you cannot see coming. The meeting had been, until that second, going as well as Brett could have hoped. He had felt the old engine turn over, the room tilting toward him the way rooms used to, and he had let himself believe, in the way a drowning man believes in a rope, that this was the turn, that the part was real, that the long, humiliating slide of the last 15 years was about to reverse. That was the cruelty of the timing, that the recognition came not at the start, when it might have been only awkward, but at the exact apex of his hope, when he had just allowed himself to want it fully. He had been performing for the two people he thought mattered, the producer and the director, and treating the quiet man in the dark jacket as set dressing, as a functionary, as the kind of person you do not bother to read. And that habit, the lifelong habit of not bothering to read the quiet people, was the thing that had hidden the cliff from him until he was already over it. The producer's casual use of a first name, the small deference in the room, that he had been too busy performing to notice. The way the others had been subtly orienting toward the man at the back the whole time, all of it arrived at once. And Brett's practiced charm faltered for the first time in the meeting, a half-second hitch that the others felt without naming. And into that hitch came the slow-rising certainty that he had been in this room before, in a manner of speaking, and that he had not been on this side of the table. It was Keanu Reeves. Of course it was Keanu Reeves. The producer had said his name. Brett had heard the name 1,000 times over 30 years, the name of one of the most respected men in the business, and had never once connected it to a desert and a water bottle and a person in dusty pads, because why would he? He had never known the name, had made a point of not knowing it, and the famous Keanu Reeves and the anonymous double from Blackwater Ridge existed in completely separate compartments of Brett Caldwell's mind, and it was only now in this room, with his career hanging on this man's opinion, that the two compartments collapsed into one, and Brett understood, with a horror that started in his stomach and rose, that the most powerful person in the room the man who held the last good part of his life in his hands, was the nobody he had thrown a water bottle at in the desert. You could see it happen on his face. The others in the room would say later. Without knowing what they were seeing, a sudden grayness, a man aging 5 years in 5 seconds. Because the horror was not only that he had been cruel to this specific man, although that was bad enough. The horror was structural, total, retroactive. If the nobody in the desert was Keanu Reeves, then every nobody Brett had ever ground down might have been anybody, might have been a future anybody, might have been keeping score, might have grown into a person who would one day sit across a table holding Brett's fate. And the entire organizing principle of his life, the belief that the people below you do not matter because they will stay below you, revealed itself in one cold rush to have been not just immoral but catastrophically, practically wrong. He had built his whole career on a bet that the small people would stay small, and he was sitting in the proof that the bet was insane, that you never know which of the people you are stepping on is on their way up, that the town has a long memory, and the longest memories belong to the ones you were sure did not count. It was not guilt that grayed his face. Brett Caldwell was not capable of much guilt. It was fear, the oldest fear, finally and fully arrived. The fear of the replaceable man who has just discovered that he was the replaceable one all along. Keanu knew him immediately. He had known him the moment Brett walked in. You do not forget the man who threw a water bottle at you on the ground and called your life worthless. Not in 30 years, not ever. And Keanu had carried Brett Caldwell in him for 3 decades. Not as an obsession. He was not a man who nursed grudges, but as a fixed reference point, the thing he had decided never to become. And here it was, in a too big suit, fading, frightened, begging, without knowing it was begging, for a kindness from the one person on earth who had the most reason not to extend it. There was no triumph in the recognition, which surprised Keanu a little, because he had imagined this moment without meaning to over the years, the way you imagine running into anyone who marked you. And in the imagining there had always been a flush of something hot, vindication or anticipation, and now that it was actually here, the hot thing did not come. What came instead was a strange, flat sadness, the sadness of seeing exactly how small the man had always been, how the cruelty in the desert had not come from strength but from this same fear wearing a younger face, and the sadness took the sweetness out of the moment before the sweetness could even arrive, because it is hard to savor your power over a man once you truly see that he was frightened the whole time, that he had been frightened in the desert and was frightened now, and had spent the 30 years in between being frightened, and that the fear had eaten his life more thoroughly than any revenge Keanu could devise. There was nothing left to do to Brett Caldwell that Brett Caldwell had not already done to himself. And here is where the story refuses to be the story you want it to be. There was a version of this moment, and Keanu felt it, that he would not pretend he did not feel, because he was a human being and not a saint, in which he leaned forward across that table and said, "Do you remember me?" In which he watched the recognition and the horror complete themselves on Brett Caldwell's face, in which he described the desert, the 9 falls, the water bottle, the words, and let the man understand fully and completely that the person about to decide his fate was the person he had ground into the dirt for sport, and then denied him the part, and let him walk out into the rest of his diminished life, knowing exactly why. Keanu felt the shape of that version. He felt how good it would feel, the clean justice of it, the closing of a 30-year circle with a snap. He was not above wanting it. Anyone who tells you he would not have wanted it is lying about being a person. He did not do it. It would be dishonest to make that refusal sound easy, or instant, or saintly, because it was none of those things, and the story is worth less if we pretend it was. Keanu sat in that room with 30 years of a remembered afternoon rising in him. The heat, and the bag, and the bottle bouncing off his chest, and the word worthless said loud enough for 40 people to hear. And he felt the pull of it the way you feel the pull of a ledge when you stand too close. A real gravity, the body's certainty of how simple it would be to lean. He had the power. That was the new and intoxicating fact of it. For 30 years, the memory had been inert because there was nothing to be done with it. And now, suddenly, there was everything to be done with it. The man was here, smaller than him, needing something only he could give. And the symmetry was so perfect, so exactly the reverse of the desert, that it felt less like an opportunity than like a gift the universe had wrapped and set in his lap. A part of him, and he would admit this later to the very few people he admitted anything to, wanted it badly. Wanted to say the word desert and watch the blood leave the man's face. Wanted, for one clean second, to be the one in the chair in the shade. And it was precisely because he wanted it that he understood what saying yes to it would cost. The wanting was the warning. The wanting was the exact feeling Brett Caldwell must have had every day of his career. Standing over the replaceable people, the feeling of how good it would be to use the position. And Keanu had spent 30 years deciding that the feeling was not a thing you acted on, but a thing you noticed and set down, the way you set a thrown bottle on a cart, because the work still has to be done. If he leaned, he would not be balancing the scales. He would just be proving that the scales were the only thing he had ever believed in, that his decency had been a function of his powerlessness all along, a thing he could afford only while he was the one on the ground, and that the moment the positions reversed, he would run the identical cruelty in the identical way. Having learned, in 30 years, nothing at all except how to wait for his turn. That was the trap, and it was a subtle one, because it wore the face of justice. He sat in the room and felt the gravity, and named it to himself and did not lean. It was the hardest easy thing he ever did, and no one in the room but him ever knew it had happened. The version of him that crushed Brett Caldwell in that room, that used his power to deliver a long-awaited punishment, would have been a man who measured his treatment of others' quarters by what they had done to him, by what they could or could not do for him, by the score. And that was the exact thing Brett Caldwell was. Brett had treated a stuntman like garbage, because the stuntman was powerless, and Brett was powerful, and Brett kept his books in the currency of power. If Keanu now treated Brett like garbage because their positions had reversed, because now Keanu was powerful and Brett was powerless, then Keanu would simply be Brett with the chairs swapped, running the identical cruel arithmetic in the opposite direction, and the 30 years of deciding to be the other kind of man would have been a lie, a posture that held only as long as he was the one on the ground. The whole point, the entire point, was to be the kind of man whose decency did not depend on his position. And you do not get to find out whether you are that man on the easy days. You find out in the room, with the water bottle 30 years behind you, and the power finally in your hands, when crushing the man would feel like justice, and would taste like honey. That is the only test that counts. And Keanu Reeves had spent 30 years getting ready to pass it, and he passed it. He did not give Brett the part. That should be said clearly, because the merciful version people imagine is not what happened either. Brett Caldwell was wrong for the role, and beyond that he was still, at 65, exactly the kind of difficult that would poison a set. And Keanu had spent his whole career protecting sets from exactly that kind of poison, protecting the crews and the day players and the stunt teams who could not protect themselves, and giving Brett the part to prove his own magnanimity would have been a betrayal of every one of those people, sacrificing the well-being of 100 invisible workers on a future set to the vanity of his own forgiveness. So he did not give him the part. The decency was not in giving Brett what he wanted. The decency was in how he refused. This is a distinction the cheap version of every such story gets wrong. The idea that the good response to being wronged is to turn around and bless the one who wronged you, to hand him the prize, to demonstrate your superiority through generosity. But that is not goodness. It is a different kind of vanity, the vanity of the magnanimous, and it has a victim, and the victim is always whoever would have had to live with the consequences of the blessing. To give Brett Caldwell a part he was wrong for, on a set he would have poisoned, would have meant that the next young stunt performer, the next day player, the next assistant who could not fight back, would have spent months eating the same contempt Keanu had eaten in the desert. All so that Keanu could feel, in some private chamber of his own self-regard, like a man big enough to forgive. He was not willing to spend other people's well-being on his own image of his own grace. That was the whole lesson of the water bottle, turned all the way around. You do not get to feel good about yourself at the expense of the people below you. Not through cruelty, and not through misplaced generosity either, because both of them treat the powerless as props in the drama of the powerful. So the refusal was the decency, and the form of the refusal mattered more than the fact of it. What Keanu did was this. He let the meeting end normally, professionally, without ever once revealing that he knew, because revealing it would have been its own kind of cruelty, the cruelty of making Brett grovel in retrospect, and he had decided not to take that. The part went to someone else, for reasons of craft, communicated through the normal channels. And then, a few days later, Keanu did one thing, the only thing, the thing that tells you who he had become. He had Hal Brennan's notebook. He had tracked Hal down years before, when he first had the means, had found the old coordinator retired and ailing in a small house in the valley, and had done for Hal what Hal had done for him, had made sure the old man was looked after, the medical bills and the rest, quietly, the way you repay the person who taught you the work and told you to wait. And Hal, before he died, which he had, 2 years earlier, had given Keanu the notebooks, all of them, the drawer full of 20 years of falls, because he wanted them to go to the one person who understood what they were, a record of the invisible people witnessed. And in one of them, on a page dated that summer in 1994, in Hal Brennan's blocky handwriting, underlined, was the account of the afternoon a star made a double, do a fall 9 times for cruelty, and threw a water bottle at him, and called his life worthless. Keanu had visited him near the end, in that small house, and they had sat with the drawer of notebooks open between them. 2 men who had each given a body to the same hard craft. And Hal had been clear-eyed about what he was handing over. He said the notebooks were not weapons, and Keanu should not use them as weapons, that the point of writing a thing down was never to hold it over someone, but to refuse to let it disappear, and that there was a difference, and that Keanu would know it when the moment came. He said he had written down 1,000 afternoons, and that most of the people in them, the cruel and the kind alike, were gone now or soon would be, and that he did not regret a single page, because a life that does dangerous invisible work deserves at least one person who bothered to record that it happened. And then Hal Brennan, who had taught a frightened young actor how to fall and how to wait, told him to take the notebooks and do something decent with them, and died not long after. And Keanu kept them in a drawer of his own and did not open them until the afternoon Brett Caldwell walked into a room and made the past suddenly present. Keanu had that page copied, and he sent it to Brett Caldwell with no note, no explanation, no signature, just the photocopied page of a dead stunt coordinator's notebook, the date, the conditions, the 9 takes, the water bottle, the words, witnessed and recorded 30 years ago by a man who believed someone should write down what was done to the invisible people. He sent it because Brett deserved to know that it had been witnessed, that the afternoon he had forgotten by dinner had been seen and recorded and remembered, that there is no such thing as a cruelty performed on a nobody, because there are no nobodies, only people whose names you have not bothered to learn, and that the universe keeps a longer memory than a frightened man imagines. He sent it without his name because the point was not, I am the man you wronged and now I have won. The point was, you were seen, you were always seen, and it was Hal who saw you. Hal who is gone now, Hal who was twice the man you are and kept a notebook because he believed your victims mattered. Let Brett sit with that. Let him recognize the handwriting of the coordinator he had bullied on a dozen sets. Let him understand that the witness was not the powerful man across the table, but the quiet one with the spiral notebook. The one nobody noticed, the kind of person Brett had spent his whole life not noticing, right up until one of them turned out to have been keeping the only record that survived. What Brett Caldwell did with that page, no one knows. Whether he understood it, whether it cracked anything open in him, or simply confirmed his sense of himself, as a man wronged by a world that had turned on him, whether he ever connected the photocopied page to the quiet man in the meeting who had not given him the part, is unknown. Because Brett Caldwell never told anyone, and within a few years he had faded entirely from the only town that had ever mattered to him, and as far as anyone can say, he was never, not for one moment, sorry. That is the unsatisfying truth at the center of it. He was not redeemed. He was barely even confronted by the standards of the confrontation people crave. He just received, one ordinary afternoon, a photocopy of a 30-year-old page and was left alone with it. And the rest is between Brett Caldwell and whatever he was capable of understanding, which the evidence of his whole life suggests was not much. And there is a deeper thing inside that page, the thing it was really sent to say, which is about the cost that nobody puts on a call sheet, the emotional cost of doing dangerous, invisible work for people who treat you as disposable. It is one thing to risk your body. The stunt performers all signed up for that, knew the price of the craft, made their peace with the knees and spines. It is another thing entirely to risk your body and then be made to feel, by the very person you are risking it for, that the body is worthless, that the risk is beneath notice, that you are a piece of equipment that happens to bleed. That second injury, the injury to a person's sense of their own worth, is the one that does not heal on its own and does not show up on any insurance form. And it is the one Brett Caldwell specialized in, because the physical danger was Hal's department, but the contempt was Brett's. And the contempt is what Keanu carried for 30 years, not the fall. The fall he could do in his sleep. The fall was the easy part. What stayed with him, what he had to actively decide every day not to let calcify into bitterness, was a man saying worthless and meaning it, in front of 40 people, about a life. Hal's page did not record the contempt. Exactly. You cannot photocopy contempt, but it recorded the facts that proved it. The 9 takes and the heat and the bottle, and sending it was Keanu's way of saying that the thing Brett had counted on, the disposability of the people he was cruel to, had never been real, that the disposable man had kept every receipt, that there had been a witness all along with a drugstore notebook, writing it down, refusing to let it be as if it never happened. So the justice was not clean. It never is. Brett was not punished in any way that would satisfy the part of us that wants the cruel brought low in public. Keanu did not avenge himself. He simply declined to become the thing he had been wronged by, and arranged for the truth to be witnessed, and went back to his work. And the people who had actually suffered, the ones the story is really about, did not all get their endings either. Hal Brennan was gone, the man who kept the notebook, who told a frightened kid to wait, who was right, and who did not live quite long enough to see the fullness of how right he had been. Some of the stunt performers Keanu had started with were gone too, or broken, the job having taken from them the body it eventually takes from everyone who does it long enough. Men and women who had hit the ground 1,000 times so that famous people could stay intact, and who had retired in pain on small pensions if they were lucky and on nothing if they were not. And no photocopied page was going to give them back their knees or their spines. Roz Tanner, who had shared her water with a nobody in the desert, was one of them. She had kept doing the work into her 60s, longer than she should have, because the work was what she had, and the pensions were thin, and a fire gag late in her career had gone a half-second long, the way they sometimes do, and she had not been the same after, had spent her last working years in a pain she did not talk about, and then could not work at all. Keanu had found her too, the way he had found Hal, and had quietly seen to it that her last years were not spent choosing between rent and medicine, and it was something, and it was nowhere near enough, and he knew it. She had taught him to check a rigging point, and to refuse a gag his gut said was wrong, had stood a little closer than she needed to when a star was grinding him down. And the most the world had given her back for 40 years of hitting the ground was a quiet benefactor at the very end. Which is to say, it had given her almost nothing, and called it a happy ending because she did not die broke. That is the arithmetic of the invisible people, and one decent man at the top, however much he remembers, does not change the arithmetic. He only softens, for a few of them, the very last of it. The wing of the world that this story shines a light on, the invisible people who do the falling, did not get saved by one man's restraint in one meeting. They just got, in Keanu Reeves, one person at the top who remembered them, which is not a solution, but is not nothing, and is maybe the most any one person can actually be. There is a coda, and it is the part Keanu would say mattered most, if he were the kind of man who said which parts mattered, which he is not. Some months after the meeting, Keanu was on a set, a real one, a film he was making, and there was a sequence, a hard one, a fall, and there was a young stunt performer rigged to do it, a performer of about 25, and there was a moment, the kind of moment that happens on every set, where the schedule was tight and the light was going, and a voice with authority, not Keanu's, a director under pressure, called for one more take of a gag that had already been landed clean, twice, a take the shot did not need. And Keanu Reeves, who was the most powerful person on that set, who could have let it go because it was not his department and not his problem, and one more take is just one more take, walked over to the rigging instead. He did not make a speech. He asked the young performer quietly if the take had been good. The performer said it had. He asked if they felt safe doing it again in this light. The performer hesitated, the particular hesitation of a replaceable person who has learned that the honest answer can cost you the next job. And Keanu saw the hesitation, recognized it from the inside, from a desert 30 years gone, and he turned to the director and said, easily, without making it a confrontation, that they had it, that the performer had landed it twice, that they should move on. And they moved on. It cost him nothing, that intervention, which is the whole point of it. He was powerful enough that protecting the young performer cost him not one thing, no political capital, no awkwardness that mattered. A easy sentence from a man whose sentences carried weight, and the contrast between how little it cost him and how much it would have meant to the kid on the rigging was exactly the contrast that the whole story turns on. Because that is the secret the powerful spend their lives not learning, that the protection of the vulnerable is almost always cheap for the strong and precious for the weak. That the water bottle and the ninth take never bought Brett Caldwell anything he needed, and the cost of not throwing it would have been nothing, less than nothing, and that the entire difference between the two men, across 30 years, came down to a handful of moments that cost the powerful one almost nothing, and that one of them spent on cruelty and the other on care. The young stunt performer who did not know and would never know that they had just been handed the thing a man named Hal Brennan had handed a frightened young actor in a medical trailer in 1994, climbed down from the rigging and went to get some water, and never understood that they had been, for one moment, witnessed by someone who knew exactly what it was to be the body on the ground, and that is as it should be. Because the best kindnesses are the ones the receiver never has to know about, the ones that ask for nothing back, not even the knowledge that they happened. I have told this story a few times now, and people always want to talk about the room, the meeting, the moment the wheel came all the way around, and the powerful man was powerless before the one he had wronged. That was never the part that stayed with me. The part that stayed with me was the water bottle. The way Keanu picked it up off the ground after Brett threw it at him and set it on the equipment cart. He picked it up. He did not leave it in the dirt, and he did not throw it back. He set it on the cart where it belonged because the airbag still had to be reset and the cart had to be kept clear, and there was a job to do, and the small mechanical decency of that gesture, a humiliated man tidying up after his own humiliation because the work still mattered, is the whole of who he turned out to be. Compressed into 3 seconds in the desert. Think about what that gesture actually contains. A man has just been told, in front of 40 people in 104-degree heat, after doing dangerous work perfectly 9 times, that his life is worth less than a camera setup. Every instinct the body has in that moment is to throw something back, to shout, to walk off, to do anything that reasserts that you are a person and not a thing. And instead, this man bends down, in his soaked pads, and picks up the bottle that was thrown at him as an insult, and he carries it to the cart, and he sets it down in its place, because the bottle on the ground is a hazard near a landing zone, and the work is not finished, and the work is the thing he respects, even when the people will not respect him. He did not pick it up because he was beaten. He picked it up because he refused to let another man's cruelty make him careless, refused to let being treated like garbage turn him into someone who left garbage on the ground. The cruelty was Brett's. The cart was Keanu's. He kept his side of it clean. That is not weakness, and it is not even patience, exactly. It is a kind of self-possession so complete that no amount of contempt can reach the place where he decides who he is, and it is the rarest thing I know of, and he had it at 30, on the ground, in the dirt, with a bottle bouncing off his chest. Brett Caldwell threw a water bottle at a man's worth. The man picked it up and put it where it went, and climbed the ledge and did the fall again, perfectly. And 30 years later, he was the one deciding. And he decided not to throw anything at anyone. And that, the picking up and the putting back, and the not throwing, that is the part that stays with me. It is a long business. Hal was right. It comes due. While this story is fictional, the lessons about how we treat the people who can do nothing for us and how long the world remembers are very real. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.